God is good, and today we're going to be talking about the power of imagination and why video games have struggled to kind of capture the imagination over the years. Not to say they haven't done it, they certainly have, but just to kind of touch on that because I think it's really important. Before we get started though, I do want to say welcome to the Nathan Napalm channel. If you've not been here before, please consider subscribing, especially if you're interested in RPGs, MMOs, that kind of thing. That's what we cover here. Also, if you could please look down below and consider joining the channel. For only $1.99, you can become a member of the Nathan Napalm and support the channel. Alright guys, let's get started. I don't think I'm causing anyone a mind blow by saying that RPGs really began with Dungeons & Dragons, the pen and paper experience back in 1974, thanks to Gary Gygax and David Arneson. This is where it all began, and people around the world began to experience fantasy lands with fantasy creatures, weapons, armor, and adventures with their dungeon masters in an infinite amount of possibilities. The thing that makes most people get so hooked on Dungeons & Dragons is that the possibilities are endless. You and your friends could literally interact with the world in any way you choose. You could murder the NPC, you could fight one another, you could go in any direction, and the Dungeon Master he's sorta just forced, as long as the dice agrees, to make it up as you go along and create the story, regardless of what everyone decided to do. Enter the world, though, of video games, where people began trying to take this exciting experience and bring it to the digital age. There were a couple of attempts in the Atari days, etc., but in my opinion, the first real stab at it came from Richard Lord British Garriott with Ultima 1, the first Age of Darkness. This PC game released in 1981 and was my very first experience with a role-playing game of any sort. I never came anywhere near beating it, as I didn't even own a computer at home and was really playing this game at school. Seriously, it was somehow acceptable for me to sit and play Ultima on the public provided computers in class because, well, computers are the future, and anything on the computer was considered learning in those days of the 80s. Such bliss were the 80s. This game though was top-down, third-person, and basically, from my gathering, you just did quests and saved up for a rocket ship to go to space, or at least best I could tell when I was a kid. Yeah, you could buy a freaking rocket ship, as well as flying cars in Ultima 1. It's a pretty strange one. But being able to explore a world in 1981 and have any sort of graphical response was pretty crazy. There were a lot of problems back then with providing text for the game, which is kind of a big deal with an RPG, right? It needs to be able to communicate with you, tell you what the NPCs say, etc. And a lot of people just didn't put very much text in it. There were RPGs released in the early 80s that didn't even have endings or anything, just a quick burst of like, good job, you won, the end. And it's kind of a crazy time. But one that I wanted to mention that I actually didn't get to play, I just know about, was a game called Wasteland. It came out in 1987 and it came with a book. And when it came to a critical part of the game or a part where you needed to read something, it would literally tell you where to go in the book to read that paragraph. So that saved a lot of space on the disk because we were dealing with floppy disks back then. They couldn't hold a lot of data, and it just kind of shows you how far along things were coming. But as of this point that we're at right now, I would like to mention that people are having to use a lot of their imagination. Pure imagination. So the graphics were just there to give you something to represent what was happening, to give you something to control. However, you were using your imagination in these fights and in these stories, and you were having to imagine how these people were talking or behaving and that kind of thing, or how they were reacting to what you were doing. There was still a ton of imagination in these very early beginning days of RPGs. And during the 80s, we saw quite a few computer role-playing games, just to mention a few. There were games like The Bard's Tale, Wizardry, several Ultima games, and the Gold Box collection of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, such as Pool of Radiance, etc. But for me, being a person who didn't own a PC in my home in the 80s, I actually got my RPG fix from JRPGs, such as The Legend of Zelda, which is technically an action RPG, but we didn't care back then. It was an RPG. Also, Final Fantasy, the first one. That's when I really fell in love with worlds, and I really felt like I was there due to the way the graphics looked, and also because it was really a game about exploration and going around and doing quests. And the story, I mean, it had a story. There's an evil bad guy and a couple of small cheesy little plot twists, but that's where it really began for me, was with Final Fantasy. I would have to say the very first one is when I realized the potential of a digital RPG and really fell in love. I personally didn't play Dungeons & Dragons till I got in middle school. But from there, going into the 90s, we began to see huge graphical overhauls. We began to see games coming out that actually could convey what was happening with more advanced systems to control your party and make actions and explore the world. And that really changed everything, because before that point, we were having to use our imagination just like we would have to in Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, we were restricted in what we could do, but we could imagine that we were doing different swings of our sword or using different weapons, or that our armor had changed, or what have you. And once it was actually shown on the screen, these things, we didn't have to use as much of our imagination, and some of the magic was lost. But there was still quite a bit of imagination because we're reading a lot. There was a lot of text to read, there was a lot of NPC dialogue and the story and all that kind of thing, so it still felt a lot like reading a book, and you're still using your imagination to a large degree on a lot of things. I would even argue that when the 3D RPGs such as Final Fantasy VII, etc., started coming out, that we began to still use our imagination because the 3D graphics were so harsh. In my opinion, honestly, the early 3D graphics, in lots of ways, looking back now with hindsight, are actually worse than the 2D sprites. It's even harder to distinguish what it is. We were just so excited by the technology that we thought it was really cool back then. However, the graphics were rough, and we still used our imagination for what those polygons were actually telling us and what they represented based off of artwork from the book or the back of the case, or etc. By the time we get to the 2000s, however, there was beginning to be most games were fully voice acted. That was becoming a thing of the norm. It was almost expected. That took away another part of our imagination because we were no longer reading text blocks, at least not all the time, and the game was telling us what the characters sounded like, and we got a little bit more of a hint of their personality due to the voice acting, etc. And now that we get to today, today's games fully, explicitly show us every minute detail, the voice acting, facial expressions, the monsters look exactly like the actual artwork. Everything is pretty well defined now. And now I do believe that the imagination is gone. There's actually no reason to use your imagination. Now, am I complaining that I think they should dumb down graphics? No, because it wouldn't be acceptable now. We have expectations, etc. But I do believe that for old school RPG lovers who just can't seem to fully get into an RPG like they used to be able to, I think the imagination is part of what's missing. I would even say this is true for MMORPGs, such as people who began playing with Ultima Online, or began playing Meridian 59, or EverQuest, when the graphics were harsher and we still had to use a lot of our imagination, mixed with nostalgia and of course the excitement of being able to play with hundreds or thousands of other people at once. Besides that, I do think the imagination plays into that aspect as well, and is part of why today it's just a little bit different when we're playing a high graphic RPG or MMO to really fully appreciate it, because we know exactly what the artist is trying to tell us, and we're no longer relying on our imagination, which could actually show that dragon in all many sorts of ways, or how the battle unfolds. We have games today that really challenge our imagination, that we can approach the story or the mission or the quest in various different ways and have a lot of input into how that story is played out in lots of different genres and games. However, I do believe that we'll never get back that spark of the old days, and I think the new generation will never fully get to understand or appreciate that unless they play a game like Dungeons & Dragons or tabletop or pen and paper style RPG, or maybe reading a book. But it's the interactiveness of an RPG, not just reading it and imagining it in your mind like you did the first time you read the Lord of the Rings trilogies, but actually having some input and you being able to make decisions in that world is a huge drive for what makes RPGs so awesome and so cool to explore and play through. So what's the point of this video? Why am I telling you all this? If nothing can be changed, if we can't, nobody's going to make a game with really rough graphics and force you to use your imagination in some kind of way these days. So what is the point of even talking or thinking about this? Well, I think it's important for us to realize this when we're judging or reviewing or playing a game and we feel like, man, this game just isn't as good. Is it really that the game isn't as good, or does it have a lot to do with your not not imagining the parts and the way things play out, but the game is doing it for you, and you have more fun when you were having to decide exactly what that dragon would have looked like, etc. And with the digital age changes the way that people actually as children are playing. Now it's pretty common for a kid to just go play a video game. When I was a kid, yeah, we played video games, but we also went outside and grabbed a stick and pretended it was a sword and tried to kill each other. Not really, we just pretended to kill each other. But you see what I'm saying, it has changed the way children even behave, because they have this representation now in a digital form. And that's all I got for today. Let me know in the comments down below if you agree with me, especially if you're around for some of those early days of RPGs, or if you play Dungeons and Dragons and you kind of see the difference between the digital and that kind of thing. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, or some experiences you had, or what your early RPGs were, because obviously I only mentioned a few in this video, so I'd love to know what got you started in RPGs, so let me know that in the comments down below. I would like to throw out a special thank you to the members of Napalm who keep this channel alive, and if you would like to become a member of the Nathan Napalm channel, please consider joining us. You can click the join button right down below. I have many packages available, the lowest of which is $1.99 per month, and you get many benefits on the channel, including early access to videos and much more. So please consider doing that. It really helps me out, keeps the lights on, and keeps me making content. And of course, if you haven't already subscribed, please definitely consider doing that. And until next time, God bless and happy gaming.
Please listen to what I say. I've been making videos all day. My friends all say I'm it's a video buffet. You can even hit replay. But please just subscribe. I can't even describe being part of my tribe. I'll even offer you a prize, but please just subscribe and hit the bell notification too.